Hi, my name is Sarah and welcome back to Freshly Read Books. So I've got a cup here of espresso made from Ethiopian coffee beans and I am ready to talk about The Shadow King. So honestly, it took a while to get to this point where I was ready to talk about this book being The Shadow King by Maaza Mengiste. So I finished this like 2 weeks ago and I've just been like trying to collect my thoughts. And honestly, it was like easy to put off just because, you know, the shortlist was coming out for the 2020 Booker Prize, and so there was videos to film surrounding that. And The Shadow King, it made it to the shortlist. It wasn't one of my predictions. It was actually one of my original predictions. So my first video where I only knew the books based on the synopsis, I chose this book as being one of the ones I thought would make it into the shortlist. And then when I redid my shortlist video, this was one of the books that I actually took off of that prediction. And that was right after I had finished reading it. Although at the time I did say that that was the one that I was least sure of, that I wasn't including on the shortlist, but I still thought that it could be. And here it is on the shortlist. I don't know, it's so hard to collect my thoughts about this book because I think my overall idea of it as a book, even post reading it, like beforehand, I was excited about it. I was excited about the premise. But even now, thinking back on the book as a whole, like the feeling I have towards that is so drastically different than how I felt actually reading the book. And I just like don't know how to talk about that. Like I feel like I have two very conflicting opinions about the book where like I didn't really like reading it. But anyways, for the synopsis, this book is a historical fiction novel that covers the period of time when Mussolini was just about to invade Ethiopia and then throughout that invasion. It focuses a lot on the women of that, because although the story is not told as much, women were a very large part of this war. They were not only helping out in camps, but they were also out on the front lines, and it's something that is not talked about as much. So Maaza Mengiste with this wanted to kind of bring that to a broader discussion, to kind of bring that to light so that people could talk more about this historical event more accurately, while still being under the realm of a historical fiction. You know, these characters aren't real. They themselves are not real people, but they do represent real people that went through this, real women that went through this. There are a few male characters as well, but it really does focus on the women. Okay, so I want to go over kind of three main themes or subjects that are throughout this book, but really I think that they all kind of boil down to just one narrative, and I think that maybe that was part of the problem that I had with the book as a whole. I really appreciate when there's a lot of different ways that you can look at a book because of all the themes, and I think instead this book boils down to one theme that you can look at in a lot of different ways. So maybe that was just like a personal preference on my part, but it really felt like the themes that it had were just like drilled into the book, and I prefer personally to be looking for them a bit more, whereas instead I feel like the messages of this book were really spoon-fed to the reader. That being said, I do think that these themes are very good, but I just wanted to be more of an active reader instead of, I felt like a passive reader as I was reading this book. I felt like I didn't really have to do anything. I didn't really have to think too hard because it was all just really given to me, which I do appreciate in certain types of books, but for a book like this that has such like a large scale impact, I wanted to be more a part of it than it just kind of happening on the page in front of me. So with that, the first thing that I want to talk about is lightness versus darkness. So you can see this theme even from the title itself, The Shadow King, this idea of shadows, which of course is casting darkness, but it can only do that if it has a light source. So this comes up a lot, a lot throughout the book. One of the more fascinating characters for like this theme for me was Etere, the photographer. So he actually works with light sources, but he would be kind of considered to be more of like in the shadows of this war. It's him that's behind the camera, you know, he's capturing what's happening in front of him, and then he would be like the shadows of that. And also he just deals in his job with lightness and darkness, making sure that he has like the correct light sources, all that. So that is really essential to his character. But then on the broader scale, the big one where this theme like kind of really comes in is this idea of the Shadow King. They talk about the emperor being the sun. And in fact, I have a quote on this one. Once it was said that the emperor was like a son to his people, but these days have proven that we live and die in the shadows. All else is illusions. So the emperor, Haile Selassie, is this figurehead. He is the sun for these people, and he is the light for these people, but then he also casts the shadow, and there's people kind of behind the scenes. So in the absence of a king, of an emperor, they are the shadow of that. And a large part of this is women. The women are in the shadows of this story as a whole, not in this story specifically. In this story, they of course shine a lot more. You get to hear about those women, about their stories, which is the whole point. So it's this idea that like the women are the ones that are hidden away. They're in the darkness. They are the shadows that are kind of holding in the groundwork, that are still working really hard. They're still out there on the front lines, but later when these stories are told, it's not going to be about the women. It's going to be about the men, the major decision makers of this war. Those are the stories that are going to be told, not the women's stories. And with that, that brings me into the second theme, so still relating to the first one. So this is focused on stories and then the women in this book. So like I said, the stories of women are not being told as much. And I was watching an interview with Maaza Mengiste about the book, and she was talking about how she thinks that women's stories are told, but they are told only to other women. Like these stories don't really make it past that. And when we ourselves look back to histories of war that are written down, it's oftentimes stories that are about men. But I liked the idea of that these stories are still being told, but they stay among women, and that really the main problem is that the women themselves are devaluing themselves, and so they don't see the importance of making the story known. And not only that, but talking about being a part of this war, it's a very aggressive thing, and the aggressive nature is, you know, left to the men. And so these stories kind of start getting lost as they're only told within women in the community. And then also not just female stories, but African stories. So in talking about like those stories, she also talked about African stories not being told as much, and as it being seen as kind of this like peripheral thing, or something that like African history is just African history, just like women history is like just women history, and it just like is contained to that. But it's really world history. Like African history is world history. It's at the center of so many things, but a lot of times, like as Mengiste was saying, like European history is seen as world history, and then like African history is like just African history, which isn't the case. I mean, especially like when you look at this war in particular, when you have Italians invading Ethiopia, like that's clearly not just Europe, they're in Africa. Like, but it's kind of ignored, it's kind of like pushed aside. And then of course, you know, I have some quotes about this section as well. I can't not. So one of the quotes I really liked for this was, "They have been stripped down to their most essential ability to carry what cannot move on its own, to shoulder weight and drag it forward." Another was probably my favorite one that was like pertaining to women was, "Girls like her were born to fit into the world. The world was not built to mold around her." So this message, and there were tons more quotes I could have read off to you. And I think that pertains to that feeling of like really being fed these themes. But I have to say, like those quotes, specifically the ones that I just read out to you, were just, I did really like those. The idea of kind of just like trying to put yourself into this world to fit where you can, and it's not going to like shape around you. You just kind of have to. And you get this sense that like each woman kind of seems like she's always somebody's burden, like being pushed around. With the main character of Harut especially, like she just kind of exists in these different places, and it almost feels like she's being pushed around. And I think that that's something that you feel when you read a lot of books that are, you know, set back in time. Like when you read Jane Austen, for example, it very much feels like, oh, where are like the sisters in Pride and Prejudice going to end up? Like, who are they going to be shoved off to? And you very much get that feel when reading about the women in this story, and not just where they are currently and where they are throughout the story, but the history behind them, about what led them to get to where they are now. It always seems like they're being kind of shoved into these different places, that they are fitting in where they can, and that the world would definitely not like mold around them. So I thought that that was a fantastic quote. And so a lot of times with like what's left for the women is to kind of just like push their way forward and continue to push forward, which brings me to the final theme, which is this feeling of like being trapped or trying to escape. And this one is brought up again and again and again for almost all, I think all of the main characters. There's at least one significant quote as it pertains to them, but just my two favorites that kind of demonstrate this as an idea is, because there is no way but through it, there is no escape but what you make from inside it. And then again later, all doors to his life had been shut right then and would remain so until he found his own way out. So you continually get this feeling of the characters being trapped where they are and needing to, from inside this space, figure out a way out, figure out a way to keep pushing forward, because that's the only way they're going to get out of it. The only way out is through, or that they kind of have to just deal with what they've got and make the best of it, try to find their own escape, because nobody's going to come and open that door for them. They're going to have to figure out how to get out themselves. So as you can see, like these themes throughout the book, they're wonderful themes. It's just that that issue that I had where it did feel like it was just laid out in front of me, like very clearly, like this is what the book is about. And not only that, but it felt like that about like 25% of the way through the book. And then it felt like for the rest of the book, it just kept pointing at those things again and being like, remember the list of things this book is about. And it just got really tiresome by the end. And I think that's what contributed to me feeling bored while reading it. Even though different events were happening and even though we were being propelled through this story, it just felt like it was saying the same thing that it was saying at the beginning of the story. And that was so clear to me at the beginning of the story that it was almost like somebody telling me the same thing, you know, 20, 30, 40 times in a row. My ideal story would have been sprinkling in these kind of hints at these greater messages, and then maybe at the end, if you're worried that the reader is not going to have picked up on the major themes of the book, then laying them out at the end instead of having them so thickly like laid on from the beginning, if that makes sense. And then another kind of problem that I had with the book was these like descriptions of pictures. While you were reading, you kind of got an idea through the story itself what the picture would be, or like what that image would be in your head. And then you got like randomly like a description, like just some text about like what was in that picture. So it felt a lot like you were being told twice, and then there would be no picture itself. I'm sure it's because the pictures like don't exist, the specific ones that Maaza Mengiste is describing, you know, to tell her story about these people that are just inspired by real people, but they aren't a specific person themselves. But that really, I don't know, it would take me out of it. Like every time one of those like pictures would show up, it would just take me out of the story again. And I would be like, what is going on? And I don't know if that's what Mengiste was going for. Like maybe this feeling of like, these are kind of like the shadows of the picture where, you know, the picture would be the light, but all you get is the shadows, the description of the picture. Like maybe she was going for something like that. But it was kind of a detriment, at least to my reading experience, and it continued to make me feel like a very passive reader. To be reading a scene and then to read a description of a picture of that scene was just like really weird, and I wasn't a huge fan of it, if I'm completely honest. So overall, I hope you understand now why I'm feeling so conflicted about this book. While I did still really enjoy the themes after looking back at the story and thinking about it once I had finished it, the actual process of going through the story just really didn't do it for me. So with all that being said, my rankings as they stand now for all the Booker books. And then I'm gonna say this in order of my enjoyment now, since the shortlist has already come out, so we're not worried about that portion of this anymore. I'm just going to talk about my personal favorites, the ones that I liked the best, and continue with that order. Okay, so currently as my rankings stand now, I have Burnt Sugar, Real Life, Shuggie, Bain, and then Such a Fun Age. And I think The Shadow King I'm going to put after Shuggie, Bain and over Such a Fun Age. I just struggle so much with it because story-wise and like the significance of it, I feel like The Shadow King would be higher, but as far like this is my own personal opinions, and I do think that yeah, this ranking is accurate. But yeah, this was by far my hardest review to do, just because like I have such conflicting opinions in my own head about it that I struggled with like making it clear in words. But hopefully this makes some kind of sense. And I hope that you enjoyed the video in general. Once again, all resources that I used for making this video are going to be in the description. The link to my entire Booker 2020 playlist is going to be in the description, as well as any information about the Booker Boy Book Club and Discord to that and everything. That'll all be down there if you want to join that discussion. It's still going strong. The shortlist is out, but we're still talking about all the books, so definitely think about checking those out. And if you are looking, and if you want to be notified for future Booker content about me, I'll be working on, of course, the last 2 books that I have not yet read from the shortlist. Those are right now my top priority. So feel free to subscribe, and then you'll know when those come out and get to watch those as well. And hopefully they make a little bit more sense than this one did. Okay, thanks again. See you in the next one. Bye.